Have you ever stopped to think why, despite all the suffering, you keep falling in love with narcissists? It seems like a mystery, doesn't it? But the truth is that this attraction is no accident. It's born deep down in your history, in your emotional wounds and childhood traumas. Often, women who grew up with a lack of affection and dysfunctional bonds end up seeking out toxic relationships without realizing it, which reproduce the cycle of rejection and abandonment they experienced. It's as if the brain, trapped in repetitive patterns, prefers the familiar to the healthy, even if it means more pain. When low self-esteem meets the external validation offered by narcissistic people, it creates an emotional addiction that is difficult to break. You find yourself trying to be enough, waiting for the other person to change, while your own essence is lost in the process. This cycle of suffering seems endless, because it's not just about the narcissist, it's about the deep roots of their emotional dependency. But there is a way out. Personal rescue, self-healing, self-knowledge, and establishing emotional boundaries to break these dysfunctional bonds and finally find true love, based on self-love. Get ready, because on this journey, you will uncover how your personal history has shaped your love choices, and you will understand why falling in love with narcissists has a reason, an emotional root that needs to be healed. Transformation begins when you decide to look inwards with courage and compassion, to recover your strength and build relationships that truly nourish your soul. Have you ever noticed how women who have lived through a childhood marked by emotional trauma, lack of affection and validation, often end up developing such a deep emotional need that they become almost blind to the warning signs? That's right. This doesn't happen out of weakness or lack of intelligence. In fact, there is a much deeper emotional root behind it. The emptiness left behind by the dysfunctional bonds of childhood makes any crumb of attention today seem like a promise of love. And this is precisely where narcissism disguises itself as true love. The narcissist understands and uses this thirst for affection to their advantage. He arrives exactly as your emotional need would have dreamed, with sweet words, exaggerated attention, and that magnetic charm that seems like something out of a movie. But behind this initial seduction lurk the same toxic patterns that feed the cycle of suffering. And do you know what's most cruel? Precisely because you're so lacking in love, external validation, and acceptance, you ignore the discomforts, close your eyes to the red flags, and dive in headfirst, believing that this time it will be different. It's as if, deep down, this woman is saying to herself, if he's choosing me, it's because I deserve it, even if it hurts a bit. And look, this belief isn't born of chance, it's the fruit of a past where love was conditioned to behave, to please, not to bother. And when childhood leaves this scar, it's almost natural to fall into this kind of abusive relationship, where love always seems like a hard prize to achieve. But is that all there is to it? Or is there something even deeper that makes you think that love and fighting are the same thing? Do you know that feeling that in order to be loved, you always have to make an effort? Well, it doesn't come out of nowhere. Women who grew up in dysfunctional homes, where love came along with demands, charges, or indifference, end up internalizing a cruel pattern. Love has to be earned. And guess who quickly realizes this? The narcissist. They become the perfect foil for this script. Someone who offers you crumbs and makes you believe that if you fight hard enough, you'll finally be enough. That's when the cycle of idealization begins. At first, everything seems like a fairy tale. The narcissist activates your anxious attachment with intense demonstrations, seduction, and that false enchantment. But when he realizes that you're already emotionally trapped, he starts to distance himself, to disappear, to generate insecurities. And do you know what happens? Your mind, accustomed since childhood to believing that love comes after a lot of effort, sees this as a challenge, not as a warning sign. That's why many women are trapped for years in toxic relationships, where they fight, mold themselves, cancel themselves out, all in the hope of being seen, chosen, and, perhaps, truly loved. and they don't even realize that they are reproducing in their relationship exactly the same emotional wounds that they experienced back then in their family ties. The question that arises is, deep down, do you still carry the belief that if you're good enough, he'll change? Inside every woman who falls in love with narcissists, there is a wounded child who believes in the impossible, that love is something that is earned, as if it were a reward. This emotional root, marked by childhood traumas, creates a scenario where anxious attachment kicks in. Then, faced with someone who is emotionally unavailable, the unconscious need arises to make amends, to be the cure for that cold and distant soul. It's a quest to fill the void left by cold parents who never offered consistent validation. But this promise, unfortunately, is false. The narcissist doesn't change because you give more of yourself, not because you lower your emotional boundaries or sacrifice yourself for the sake of the relationship. On the contrary, they reinforce repetitive patterns, feeding the cycle of suffering and emotional dependence. What looks like love is actually a mirror game that reflects your own wounds and emotional neediness. You have to understand that real change only begins within you, with personal redemption and self-knowledge. That's why the challenge lies in recognizing that your role is not to fix the other person, but to heal yourself. Instead of feeding abusive relationships and dysfunctional bonds, it's time to strengthen your low self-esteem, set clear boundaries, and practice self-love. Self-healing doesn't happen overnight, but it's the only way to break the cycle and find a love that doesn't depend on external validation or a constant struggle. It's amazing how the narcissist's behavior creates a cycle that traps many women in toxic relationships. Intermittent validation, where affection appears and disappears without warning, activates a real emotional addiction. Those who grew up with childhood traumas and affective neediness end up getting caught up in this game, because the brain desperately seeks that rare and unpredictable dose of attention that it so craves. It's like a fuel that keeps the cycle of anxious attachment going. A practical example is a relationship where the person receives messages or compliments sporadically, going days or weeks without contact, and this oscillation generates an emotional roller coaster. This not only feeds emotional dependency, but also reduces self-esteem, because the woman begins to measure her value by the frequency and intensity of this attention. She accepts crumbs and minimizes the lack of consistency, believing that this is love or something that must be earned. To break this pattern, it's essential that she learns to identify this mechanism and works on rescuing herself, investing in self-care and setting emotional boundaries. This is the first step to strengthening self-love and breaking out of the cycle of suffering that abusive relationships and narcissism impose. And only when the emotional root is healed will the search for a healthy relationship become possible. A topic that is just around the corner in the next step. Understanding that healing comes from within is an essential step for anyone who wants to break the cycle of toxic relationships and narcissism. Often, what keeps this emotional dependency going are the emotional wounds of childhood, where affective neediness and the search for external validation took deep root. Healing this pain means taking an honest look at yourself, recognizing your vulnerabilities, and above all, accepting that you deserve much more than crumbs of affection. A practical path to this self-healing involves self-knowledge, trying to understand what repetitive patterns manifest themselves in love relationships and how they relate to the dysfunctional bonds of the past. Therapy, support groups, or even daily reflection practices can help to restore low self-esteem and strengthen emotional boundaries, which are the key to breaking the cycle of suffering that lack of affection perpetuates. You have to remember that the cure doesn't depend on the narcissist changing, but on you freeing yourself from the need to be validated by those who are incapable of offering true love. This personal rescue is the real turning point for transforming your life and building healthy relationships based on self-love and emotional autonomy. And so a new phase begins, full of possibilities and conscious choices. Now that you understand the deep roots that lead to falling in love with narcissists and how emotional dependency and childhood trauma shape these repetitive patterns, the next step is to apply this knowledge to the practice of self-healing. Are you ready to look inwards, recognize your emotional limits, and begin to reclaim your self-love without depending on the external validation that once seemed so vital? Think, how many times have you allowed yourself to repeat toxic cycles, hoping that this time it would be different? How many times have lack of affection and low self-esteem made you accept less than you deserve? Now, I invite you to question these choices and take control of your own emotional destiny. How can you start today to set limits and prioritize your self-knowledge? So, are you ready to take the first step away from dysfunctional bonds that only bring suffering? Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications if you want to learn more about how to break this cycle and build true relationships. Your transformation starts here, and I'll be with you every step of the way.